Hi, I'm Larry Reed, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Doug Stewart, your host, and I have special guests with us, Ed Noell. Ed is the professor of economics and business at Westmont College and president of the Association of Christian Economists. His current research includes work on the value of property rights and contract enforcement in the developing world from a Christian perspective, particularly with respect to securing the property of the working poor from land grabs and encouraging small business among the poor. He is also the co-author of a book, Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism, and he is here today to talk with us about capitalism and consumerism. Ed, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, so capitalism has, and it's not lately, I was about to say lately, but capitalism has gotten a bad rap. And I think partly, at least from the Christian angle, it is critiqued, and you read the critique and you're thinking, that doesn't quite seem right as a person who embraces capitalism. And I would label what they're describing and disdaining, sort of rightly, as more consumerism. And I think that's kind of inherent in some of the critiques. And I don't think those things have to go together. I know you don't think those things do either. So how would you define consumerism? And do you think we live in a society that's excessively consumptive?
Well, consumerism, I would see, is very much tied to sort of a need for acquisition, to always to get more, to never being satisfied sort of with the material goods that go beyond satisfying our need for food, clothing, and shelter, but continually always wanting to acquire more. I don't necessarily associate or tie in consumerism exclusively to capitalism. And I think that is a mistake to sort of identify those two, or to say that consumerism is inherently a part of capitalism. One way to think about capitalism is to compare it, let's say its forms around the world, in terms of a portion of the consumer economy that occupies a capitalist economy's GDP. We think of the U.S., 70% or so of our economy is preoccupied with household spending in various forms, durable goods, non-durable goods, and of course, especially services. You go to Northeast Asia, and that percentage is not as high, over 50%, but nonetheless, the consumption portion of the economy helps drive the engine of those capitalist economies. But the reality is that, as we've talked about this drive to acquire, what earlier Christian thinkers even spoke of as a kind of avarice, a lust after more goods, that it precedes capitalism. It's pre-capitalist. It goes as far back as the feudal world, the medieval world of the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, if not further back. And so clearly, that's we wouldn't characterize the European economies of the feudal era as capitalist. It's a pre-capitalist era, and yet we can think about concerns about consumerism at least dating to then.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the problem, it's part of the human problem to want to have more in a way that's unhealthy and spiritually damaging, if you will. I wonder what percentage of the 70% is, consumer spending is spending on things we quote unquote don't need versus spending things on just, we need to live. I mean, the spending, I bought food today at the grocery store. And I need that. I may not have needed, to buy the highest priced item. I could have bought something less expensive. And so I could have been satisfied with more, I could have been satisfied with less,
right,
and saved the money or whatever. So I'm kind of like, maybe there's no data on that, but like, I wonder if people would say, oh, well, yeah, of course it drives the economy, but we could survive on less. I'm thinking, of course, the critics of capitalism.
And certainly there are those who would prefer that we return to a simpler lifestyle. And there's some of them are among the Christian community, and would see less of a proclivity to avarice or excessive acquisition there. I suppose I could speak from the standpoint of my discipline of economics, and economists are much prefer to speak in terms of wants and don't want to sort of make a judgment as to what are needs, because needs differ subjectively from one person to another in terms of their satisfaction, as do wants. And so the fact of the matter is, though, even in again, the pre-capitalist era, when we had, we could say people, the vast majority of the world living in subsistence, which was really true unless you were a part of sort of the royal element of society, or you benefited from being a slave master, that sort of thing. The vast majority of the world, whichever continent you want to look in, up until the era of the early 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution really begins to make headway, lived at subsistence. And there were those that did consume in excess at times, but largely people were concerned with having their needs met, and for the typical person anyway. And their lifestyle wasn't characterized by excessive pursuit of wants.
Do you think as Christians critique things around us about the culture that, ought to be spoken out against? I mean, we could, of course, speak out against greed, and we can speak out against gluttony, and, anything that we could think of that's worth, that's part of our Christian calling and mission to reach out and call people to repentance and things like that. Is there it seems to me that like the Ron Siders and the Jim Wallaces of the world, they want to call out the sins of capitalism. They want to call out the sins of, greedy people doing this or that. Is there room for that as Christians to call out excessiveness in ways that are not healthy?
I think there is a place for that, although I wouldn't share their linking of that idea of excess inherently, again, associated with a market economy, with a market-driven economy. And another kind of critic is Daniel Bell or his colleague William Kavanaugh, who sort of see our desires distorted towards excess acquisition by the capitalist economic system. And I would suggest, again, with any economic system, that bent within fallen human nature can be driven by the economic system. That whether it's socialist, whether it's a mixed system, whether it's in a strong welfare state. But yes, there is a place, I think, for Christian values to repent, and that's part of this essay you mentioned in the Counting the Cost book that I wrote on Christianity and capitalism and consumerism, in which I argue that we should, as Christians, delight in both creation and the responsibilities of affluence. And I think that part of it really speaks to your question. To what degree do we have a responsibility of affluence, recognizing, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, the warnings about the spiritual hazards associated with wealth, a responsibility to use it wisely? And I pair those two in the subtitle of this piece because I see Scripture affirming the celebration of creation, a celebration of creativity and affluence, but at the same time, an emphasis on stewardship, particularly toward those who are without. And that's why I spend a portion of the piece on the example from this of the Synoptic Gospels of Luke chapter 12, with the parable of the individual who has built a lot of barns for himself because his crops are so productive.
Have you noticed that I've seen sort of an irony or maybe a contradiction in the sort of anti-capitalist mentality, is that they seem to use phrases like limited resources, and they have this outlook that we would classify as sort of zero-sum outlook on the resources, natural resources of the earth. And at the same time, they often talk about, they make these claims that, we shouldn't have poverty because there's enough to go around. And, we have this plentiful, there's enough to go around in the world. But at the same time, they, on the other side of the flip side, they're like talking about limited resources. And it just seems very common that there's a zero-sum outlook on the world when they have that. Is that Does the zero sum thing just really infiltrate their analysis?
I think you're very much onto something, Doug, that there is a bit of a contradiction in that take and emphasizing a 0% perspective, a fixed economic pie. Well, one person's gain comes at the loss of the others exactly, so that one person's gain means the other's resources are diminished by that amount. I think that the way that they would want to attempt to resolve that contradiction, speaking of someone like particularly Jim Wallace, is toward redistribution. The fact that we have over half of the U.S. income distribution today, the Census Bureau reports, in the hands of the top 20%, well, that's inherently unfair. That gain must have come at the expense of those in the bottom, particularly the bottom two quintiles, bottom 40%. And so we've got to have redistribution. In fact, Jim Wallace says that inequality is the call of the Old Testament prophets to resolve inequalities of rich and poor. I don't read the prophets that way, and I wrote a piece on this in the Southwestern Journal of Theology, that really what they're talking about is oppression of the poor, violence towards the poor, appropriation of their property, that's what the prophets are speaking out against, not inequality per se. And so I think their attempt to resolve that contradiction, which I agree with you is there, I don't concur is really, in fact, either supported by the idea of a zero-sum world, because we don't live in a zero-sum world as long as we emphasize freedom of people to create, and which I think is part of being made in the image of God, and freedom to exchange. And then B, I think, again, the scriptures don't emphasize certainly in the Old Testament prophets, a need to resolve inequality per se. I do think, I would say this, that a zero-sum worldview among the Greco-Roman world in first century Palestine was pervasive because in the Roman world, the publicans and the tax gatherers would oppress the poor peasant, poor landholders, and those who worked on the field through the tax system. And they associated the gains of the wealthy and those associated with the Roman government who had privileges from them with tapping into the poor. But that's not inherent in a market economy, though. That's where I would differ.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of the analysis, and I think we're all probably guilty of this if we don't do deep contextual studies, and possibly even further than just that. But I think we're guilty as interpreters that to assume, and it's pretty easy to do, and I don't think it's that egregious at first until you base your whole theology on it, that the world in which we're reading the text and understanding the text is similar to our own. And so when there's critiques of rich people, it's just taken as such that, rich people must be bad, or the acquisition of many things must be bad. And, we don't take into a context that it often was zero sum because it was about exploitation. It wasn't market economy exchange. And obviously there can be exploitation now in our world today, but it was far less the case that it was market economy way back then.
No question. And I think if we read the parables of Jesus and his teachings, particularly again in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, where there's much more of an emphasis in his teachings on wealth than, say, in John, that it's really important to understand that first century Roman Palestinian context, to understand not only about wealth, but debt and taxes, and how Jesus just taps into the everyday life of those who are among his hearers to connect with them. But to understand his teaching there, you really have to understand what's going on in the first century Roman world, how a zero-sum game sort of pervaded the mindset of many people because of the exploitation. In some cases, because the wealthier people, as I say, the publicans, and there was a tax-gathering system where you paid for the right to collect taxes from Rome, and then you went out and just grabbed as much as you could from the peasants and others, of the poor in first century Roman Palestine. That would naturally be a kind of mindset of concern about exploitation. Having said that, I do think it is important to recognize that when Jesus teaches on the parable of the tares and wheat, that there are some warnings about the spiritual hazards associated with excess wealth, particularly where we neglect the stewardship, the responsibility we have to share with others, again, in a non-coercive fashion, in a voluntary fashion, through church, through NGOs and other ways. That has to be recognized as well.
The economic outlook that many Christian anti-capitalists, and I don't want to pit them as 100% anti-capitalist, but they're very critical of modern day capitalism. They often seem to, when you start debating economics and you start getting into like just that aspect of what exactly is going on in the economy, and here's how we think you're wrong in your assessment of what's actually happening, they seem to reply, and this has just been my experience in a number of ways, that it's just all Keynesian economics. Like that's their embrace, like they've embraced that. And I've actually had one person who's incredibly intelligent, has written books, and he's not, I mean, he's kind of like the Jim Wallace side of the spectrum there. And he's kind of like, well, yeah, I've studied all this, and Keynes has more to offer than Mises does, or something like that. And I'm like, it seems to me that Keynesianism is more in the consumer side of the approach to economics than anything.
Well, ultimately, of course, Keynes, as his remedy for the problems of being far below full employment, not only in his own Britain, but for other Western market economies in the midst of the 1930s Great Depression, called for indirectly boosting consumer spending by massive increases in governmental spending, particularly for the U.S., the federal level. And through a kind of multiplier effect, the notion of Keynes and the Keynesians who followed him would be that would encourage greater consumer spending. So the irony there is that, yes, the Keynesian remedy is more spending, less saving. There's a paradox of thrift. Thrift ultimately is damaging to an economy, especially that has a very large, as we say, recessionary gap, or a big gap from full employment. And so we should encourage much more spending. And actually, there's a bent, if you go back and look at Keynes and the Bloomsbury group that he was associated with, in opposition to at least sort of the Protestant emphasis on coming out of the Reformation and later Puritan values on savings, on future orientation, saving now to build your enterprise and provide the capital for growth. Those were older Victorian values that the Bloomsbury group that Keynes was associated with in the early 20th century deliberately shunned. We should avoid those. And we should look forward to a time, if we have the ability to fine-tune the economy and government spends adequately, that we can return to full employment, but through a lot of spending on material goods.
Hi, this is Carrie Baldwin of MereLiberty.com and a contributor here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you haven't heard, I'm debating Walter Block on the question of whether a woman has the right to evict or abort her fetus at any time during her pregnancy. This debate will be hosted by the Soho Forum at 3 p.m. on Sunday, December 8th at the Subculture Theater in New York City. Tickets for this event range from $12 to $24. Seating is limited and will likely sell out. Register now to reserve your seat. You can buy tickets at thesohoforum.org. To hear more about my position, you can visit my website at mereliberty.com/abortion.
So let's kind of shift gears. It's probably a good segue to talk about spending here. And, we're all, in many senses, we're all consumers. We have to consume things, like sometimes literally, like we eat food and we go through goods, on a pretty regular basis, and we use things. Some things we have last a long time, but other times we use things. So when we think about spending, we can't ignore the fact that we consume. And I think one of the critiques that a lot of people have about consumerism isn't always about that we spend money, and they may have some concerns about how we spend money, but it's that, and again, this is like shifting the blame in a way to big business or business that does marketing. And so it's all about like, we're losing our freedom, even though, we're kind of, sort of sovereign or whatever, we kind of lose our freedom as consumers because we're being manipulated by marketing. I'll give you an example. The day that I actually read your chapter in the book, Counting the Cost, when I was done, I got on my computer and I decided to write a few things down. And my email notification came up and it was from Audible, and it was the daily deal. It was $4. And I was like, oh, that looks really good. And I bought it. It took me all of about 2 minutes. Now, one could say, and I didn't need to. It wasn't a need. It was an interest. It's a 10-hour book, and it will probably enhance my life. I don't know yet. I haven't started listening to it yet, but it'll probably enhance my life. And yet, at the same time, I could have spent that $4 elsewhere. I could have saved the $4. I could have had a more meaningful experience. I could have taken my daughters out for ice cream and sat with them and done something a lot more meaningful than, listening to this not needed audiobook. Okay. And so what happened was marketing, an email that I got for the daily deal, has changed my sort of interests to do something that's slightly less healthy or maybe very less healthy, depending on the situation.
Well, and I like that example. Let's reflect on that a little bit. I think there's no question that Audible and whichever firm you might want to think of, whether they sell over product in cyberspace or it's a brick and mortar store one walks into, is targeting an audience, and they're aiming. They may be aiming at folks that like to buy more online and are involved in podcasts to work with Audible, or it might be another form of audience, whether it's teen, preteen, and so forth. But the question is, of course, what one does with that information. Once you've learned about Audible, they provided that information. How does the consumer respond to that? And I think there's no question there's an informational content that's important for the rational consumer. There's an emotional content and a persuasive element to advertising. Ultimately, being made in the image of God, we think about what it means to have the imago Dei, the image of God. We're called to be discerning and sort through the information we have, reflect on, as you mentioned, the opportunity cost. If I use my resources for the Audible book, what am I foregoing as a different opportunity? In that sense, the consumer, we might say, to use economists and social science language, is sovereign. But at the same time, I'm not doubting the important impact the billions of dollars spent on advertising. I just say let's turn that around and look at that, the benefits from that from another side. Firms want to establish their brand, but brands aren't merely a means of making everyone buy in a kind of homogeneous fashion the very same product. Brands can be a way for firms to innovate. They've got the consumer's eye or ear, if you will, and they can try new products that appeal to a wider variety of consumer tastes. And if we really have a competitive market economy, firms are being pushed always to innovate and offer differing variations on products, variations, or they're not going to make it. And it could be from the mundane that Burger King is now offering tacos to the much higher end of what a Lincoln or Mercedes offering with voice-activated features in your automobile. Again, I think we need to recognize the implications of being made in the image of God, the creativity that comes with that, and the calls for us to be rational and discerning with the marketing efforts and the advertising efforts that come our way.
You talk about innovation, and, Deirdre McCluskey has written that it used to be the case that innovation was not something that was looked at positively. And part of the reason we have such an abundant world is that the change in rhetoric and the belief about such things changed, and that pursuing something that we would call innovative, which in a way, I would say everybody, both anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist, whatever, we often embrace the idea of innovation in this stage at capitalism. Even if you're anti-capitalist, you don't, novel things that improve the plight of the poor, that improve the plight of everybody are not typically denounced. In and of themselves. So we have this world of abundance in part because we have innovation. And I think there's obviously a lesson to learn there with respect to, what they need to be grateful for where we've gotten. Like, there's so many innovative things that are helping the poor. There are so many innovative things that are helping those who, at this point, like, not necessarily poor, but like poorer middle class, and like our lives are immensely better. And the net benefit of this world and the capitalism that we have is, of course, that we're all better off. And so I'm often puzzled, maybe you can speak a little bit to this, is like, why are people rejecting this abundance of not abundance of natural resources, but our application of the resources that we have? Because, some people say, oh, well, you were just lucky to be born in an age or a location in the world that is fruitful and abundant. And I say, you know what? I look at that as a blessing. We can say lucky or whatever, but like, to me, it's a blessing to have a world where when we have free trade, we get abundance. It's not a surprise to me that that's the way God set it up.
Well, it's a very interesting question. And there are those who critique not just innovation, but the fact that there is a provision, a multiplicity of styles and variations on product there that as too much choice. And there's certainly those who come out of both economics and psychology or mesh those disciplines that argue that we live in a range of too much information and too much choice, and it's dizzying consumers. And at the same time, I would think about that critique to say, I think there's a lot to McCloskey's argument in that trilogy, bourgeois dignity, bourgeois equality. And we've written on, I in fact edited a symposium on that in Faith and Economics, the journal of the Association of Christian Economists. Again, coming back to the place that we're in as Christians today, we do have a different kind of challenge in a world of affluence than, say, the Christian of the first century. And as we read the scriptures, we ask different kinds of questions about an excess of choice. At the same time, it strikes me we have to return to this notion of the importance emphasized in Holy Scripture of stewardship, that innovation is an expression of creativity, and we should celebrate that just as Jesus celebrated being material abundance. He ate with those who society rejected, celebrated with sinners and publicans, but at the same time told us to be responsible with our resources. So innovation done responsibly, we have to be discerning about that. We have to be discerning as consumers about it. And if we feel like we are inundated with too many choices, we have ways to restrict ourselves. We're called at times to go and reflect and withdraw. We're called it a spiritual discipline is fasting, that one removes themselves from the excess of temptation that might come with gluttony. So I think there's this idea that being a responsible steward means celebrating innovation and creativity, but being discerning about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can turn off those email notifications from Audible. I don't have to see the daily deals.
Right, exactly.
There's a way to turn that off. Yeah,
and then how we think about how we teach our kids and we encourage others in these things is part of that too, I think.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about Luke 12 and your understanding of Jesus's assessment of what was happening with the rich man and his storing up of possessions. I think your take on it is poignant for the way in which we think about storing up wealth, because it's not inherently wrong. There's something else going on there.
Yes, and so in Luke 12, verses 13 to 21, often depicted as the rich fool, the story that Jesus tells, who hoards his possessions because he's got a bountiful crops and he builds larger barns to store all these possessions. And I think as one reads through that, it's interesting that if you look at it carefully, there's, again, a sense in which there's something to be celebrated in the productivity of the fertile land and the bounty of the crop that's going on here. But also there's this concern that the person that Jesus is describing here has accounted for himself by laying up many goods and saying that I can take my ease and eat and drink and be merry, that there's a kind of tyranny they've succumbed to here, that they place their security in the material possessions themselves, and unwittingly thinking that they're rich, are not rich towards God. Because as Jesus reports, God tells this person, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you prepared? So is the man," Jesus says, "who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." And I think in the context of Luke particularly, this particular gospel, not only here, but as he teaches elsewhere the story of the rich man and Lazarus, that he's emphasizing we've got to be aware of what comes with those material possessions, the responsibility to not place our security in them, but to be aware of our surroundings, be aware of those who have less than those among us. In that passage, and then further on in Luke 16, it's the rich man's ignorance of the beggar Lazarus who's lying at his door. It's not his sin of owning possessions or enjoying them, but it's in his use of them and putting his weight of trust in them that Jesus is warning his disciples about.
How do you advise Christians to exercise stewardship? You describe it in your chapter in the book, exercise careful stewardship, because it's more than just critiquing the sins. It's also being proactive with the wealth that we have. And I'm going to use the word wealth there kind of in quotes, because all of us, anybody who could be listening here, you may not think of yourself as wealthy, but you do have resources and talents and skills that can be put to use even in small measure. As Christians, we don't believe that you have to be wealthy to be, to have things worth giving. So just in the sense that as Christians, we exercise stewardship. You've kind of mentioned a few things throughout this conversation. Do you have any advice for Christians, wanting to be thoughtful about it? What kind of questions should we be asking when we make, decisions, buying decisions, giving decisions, those kinds of things?
Yes, I think you raised some important, valuable points here, and particularly as we think about sort of our own personal finance and use of stewardships. Particularly as I think about a Western Christian, where our average standard of living per capita GDP in the U.S. is, for some countries 10 times larger, and in some cases 100 or up to 500 times larger, the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But really for any Christian, at least in the Western world, especially, it's about being aware of what comes with our material abundance, being aware of the needs of those in the church we've covenanted and joined in our community. It's sad to me to see that reported among the evangelical world that the average level of giving is in the neighborhood at the most 2 to 3% of income. And I'm not necessarily making a case here for the literal 10% Christian tithe. That's a whole other discussion. But it is just sad to see the need, I'll just say, for being aware of what's going on not only in our church, but in our community, how you can address that. As you say, not only with the material resources of income we have, but the time we have, the talents we have if I'm a Christian business person, how do I help others around me find their own way, their talents to perhaps start their own business, to employ them? If I find those who are really indigent, and the New Testament, the way it depicts the poor, that's really someone who's really destitute. How can I find ways to lift them up? And how can I implement the model, if I'm a Christian business person, from the gleanings from the poor from the Old Testament, to share out of my surplus with others? So it's being aware. I think it's being cognizant, especially in the local area. We have a responsibility globally, but I would say first, primarily, it's to our local church and community, being cognizant of how to think more broadly about how I might use my talents in that community.
Wow, that's all great. Ed, you are doing some research on the value of property rights from a Christian perspective in contract enforcement in the developing world. That's kind of what I read in your bio. tell us a little bit about this project and some of the things that you're working on, because I'll kind of tie this in here a little bit, because one of the critiques I've heard of capitalism is that our world is based on this theory of property rights that doesn't come from the Bible. The Lockean sort of, mix your labor and it's yours kind of approach. And that if we really, that's so the story goes, if we were really use the Bible as our foundation, we wouldn't have such a strong property rights in the way that we do sort of mentality.
Yes. And so I have currently moved into some thinking about the importance of property rights and contracts, basis of contracts, and what we call in economics transactions costs for the poor, for the developing world poor particularly, and how property rights are relevant. And here is, I would speak to what you mentioned there. I don't subscribe to property rights on a Lockean kind of foundation that our labor mixed in is the basis of property rights. I think it's grounded in the, candidly, the Decalogue, the 8th commandment of the Decalogue, that you shall not steal, that being created in God's image, we're endowed with resources. He calls us to take and use and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with the production and the value from them. There's a value added in what we do in creation that's there, evident from Genesis 4, with the creation of tools and music and the early civilization that's evident there. And in the 21st century world, whether it's in fashioning software, starting an enterprise and NGO that helps in agriculture or textiles or a whole range of different products, there's a value added that we express in creativity that's important with property rights. Ultimately, God's the ultimate owner of all creation. We are, the property resources we have are leased from Him. We're accountable for how we use them. Ultimately, we return to Him. But the parable of talents, I think, teaches us from Matthew 25 that we're accountable for how we take the resources given us, however much they are, and multiply them and put them to productive use. And so what I'm interested in particularly is the way in which the poorest of the poor in the developing world, particularly I'm thinking of widows and those who have had their land stolen from them. Particularly the examples I'm interested in are sub-Saharan Africa, Uganda, for example, where there are land grabs and the widow's property is taken from them, that introducing property rights becomes very important, that are backed by a judicial system that is based in the rule of law and not of men, where judges can't be bribed by those who have seized property arbitrarily to rule against the widow. And how do we, as Christians, step into that situation? The work of an international justice mission and others of dealing with violence against the poor. Because ultimately I see parallels from the Old Testament where property is grabbed in Israel, as Isaiah describes in Isaiah 5 and Amos as well, where those who are wealthy use the government, use the monarchy of Israel to help them grab land. I see some parallels with that. Not exact parallels, but similarities with what's happening in the developing world. And so this is what I'm looking at, is how property rights matter, because that's the basis for stewardship. Ultimately, if you don't have a right to property, how are you accountable for what you use for it, right? If it's all in common, how are we accountable? And so that's how I would bring to bear a kind of scriptural perspective on that.
Well, and now I think we have our reason for you to come back on for a future episode, because this is a very important topic.
Well, Doug, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for being on to talk to us about consumerism, Ed. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you again.
Thank you for having me, and I've appreciated very much our dialogue.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
Hey, podcast listeners. Since you like listening to audio content, we wanted to let you know about a new audiobook titled Called to Freedom: Why You Can Be Christian and Libertarian. It's read by me, Jacqueline Isaacs, one of the contributing authors of the book, and every download helps to support the Libertarian Christian Institute. To learn more and to download the audiobook today, go to calltofreedombook.com.